It's been a while since I devoted a video solely to just Dragon Ball, so I thought now might be the ideal time to return. And because my last comparison between the movies has been gaining some traction lately, I'll continue that trend by ranking all the franchise's various films, with the addition of the TV specials. And to begin, the absolute worst in Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball GT, A Hero's Legacy, which follows Goku's descendant, aptly named Goku Jr., on his quest to find the Dragon Balls in order to cure his ailing grandmother Pan. For the record, in Japan, this aired between episodes 41 and 42 of GT as a TV special, but for some reason the English language distributor Funimation released it as its own independent film instead. To start off, this is the most egregious case of someone undeservedly attaining the Super Saiyan transformation, which honestly makes how the Universe 6 Saiyans acquired it legendary in contrast. The main rationale behind this pertains to the nature and personality of Goku Jr., who in this special was established as a coward, unable to keep up with the now elderly Pan's training, and picked on by average kids in school. So all these traits run contrary to the perceived attributes of a Super Saiyan. Now an argument against my logic exists, that an early Dragon Ball Z Gohan possessed a similar personality, but the key difference between why unlocking Super Saiyan works for Gohan and not for Goku Jr. centers around when they achieved it. Gohan had essentially overcome all of his weaknesses prior, and had already been introduced to the transformation by his father, whereas Jr. randomly attained it when fighting the villain, with no confirmation that he'd even outgrown his cowardice, so the latter was basically gifted a power-up without any justification. Speaking of villains, there are two sets of them. Mamba, a blue-skinned woman with orange hair that she can control as hand-like appendages, and the other antagonist, a purple boar demon, Lord Yao, that can change his arms into various weapons. Now as the female enemy. The contrast between her skin and hair does give her a somewhat decent color scheme in her character design, but even then, other characters from the franchise share the exact same color palette, and they did it earlier. One of the turnoffs for her as a villain was how the story built her up to be the main antagonist, only to be scared off by the true villain of the special, Lord Yao, who really appeared out of nowhere, so her fleeing in terror makes her feel like a bit of a disappointment. Now, I wouldn't be surprised the writers used her to emulate the Pilaf gang from Dragon Ball, i.e. comedic relief characters with two accompanying minions, but even then she comes more across as a waste than as a fun remembrance. Moving on to the Boar Demon. The awkward aspect present in his character is that at least by Dragon Ball standards, he's not threatening, and his strengths would fall beneath opponents Goku beat pre-Roshi training in early Dragon Ball. I mean, a normal bear had temporarily held him at bay, so overall he just couldn't capture the same drama and intensity as prior villains, even against ones that shared a similar length of running time. What also made this special weak revolved around what it didn't do. Now, this story occurs around 100 years after the conclusion of Dragon Ball GT, and it stated that essentially everyone of that era, minus Pan, had died since then. But despite that, the story still could have explored and provided fun references / Easter eggs to past series, like how Goku Jr. was in school. Have him being taught a false lesson of how Hercule, aka Mr. Satan, saved the world from Cell. Or the narrative could have at least answered questions surrounding the long-living characters like Master Roshi. One aspect of this special that it did do decently was by having Goku Jr. recover the 4-star Dragon Ball at Grandpa Gohan's house, where the Dragon Ball franchise began, and to ultimately encounter his ancestral namesake here, which in turn makes this story come full circle by ending where the franchise began. A great way to sum up a hero's legacy involves the fact that by the special's end, Pan rescued the hero of the story via helicopter, as he had yet to learn to fly. So this story, very much like its protagonist, never got off the ground by its own merits, and did so through artificial means, like by a helicopter, or simply belonging to the Dragon Ball brand. So all in all, it's an underwhelming story that wore the skin of Dragon Ball, but lacked its innards, or maybe more correctly said, the comprehension of what made its predecessors so great. Next up, the worst actual film of the franchise, Dragon Ball Z Resurrection F. Oh, where to start with this disaster? Okay, I think we can all agree that much of Dragon Ball is supposed to be subjective, or at least open to different interpretations. But regardless, despite some instances never being confirmed, many saw them as correct. For example, I always saw the original Goku vs. Frieza fight as a battle between Frieza, the natural, with presumably maxed-out potential, versus the limitless but hard-working Goku. But was this film reviving Frieza and powering him up beyond every Z antagonist following him, or at least pre-Battle of the Gods, unintentionally ruins the best dynamic in his original battle against Goku? Now, someone listening might say I'm sourly downvoting Resurrection F because it indirectly damaged my interpretation of Frieza. Even if that is the case, the film still created inconsistencies in the past, making both Goku and Frieza look foolish. The moment I'm referring to occurred nearing the end of their fight, where the Saiyan said to the exhausted Frieza, "I'm going home. Come back when you've picked up a few new tricks." With that statement in mind, think about it like this. In a matter of months, Frieza's power level skyrocketed from the millions to the quintillions. So if he took Goku up on that offer, within a few weeks, he would have been unbeatable to anything less than a god of destruction to your opponent. So this movie's existence lessens iconic scenes from the original series, by making both characters come off as overconfident idiots. Another way this movie attacked audience interpretations pertained to the relegation of Goku and Vegeta from masters of combat to Whis' students. Again, nowhere in the story did it state they perfected their fighting styles, but at numerous points it heavily implied they had. For example, in the Cell Saga, both Goku and Vegeta realized that the bulked-up Super Saiyan Grade 3 would hinder them in combat by slowing their mobility, while the inexperienced, apprentice-like future Trunks harnessed it without thinking of the potential restrictive ramifications. Of course, mastering fighting doesn't inherently mean they're the strongest, as other methods like fusion, absorption, and weird rituals can boost someone above a master. But Whis' training didn't do that. It literally reduced him to the state of apprenticeship again. Remember Whis telling them, Goku, you need to be more serious in combat, and Vegeta, you should be more relaxed. So lines like that made it seem like the Saiyan duo had actually regressed from what they once were. Next up, the mishandling of characters present in the film. First off, the malicious treatment of Yamcha, where for some reason the cast deemed him too weak to participate in the battle against the Frieza force. For starters, Yamcha would have effortlessly handled Frieza's soldiers. I mean, pretty much until an interview with Toriyama post-Battle of the Gods, the majority of fans believed Yamcha would have beaten Final Form Frieza, primarily stemming from the Buu Saga filler. Now admittedly, even then there was debate about whether that scene was out of place. But the fact that the people who drew the original series wrote him into a scene like that, at least proves he probably should have joined the battle against the Frieza force. On the flip side, why was Roshi there? He was without a doubt weaker than Yamcha. Roshi has no accomplishments to indicate why he belonged there. Yamcha had at least received training from King Kai to earn him a spot there, whereas Roshi had nothing. It's almost like this film tried to please a group who only views this series as just a meme. On another note, why did Krillin become a cop? It wasn't funny, and it didn't make him a more enthralling character. All it did was consume time in an unproductive manner. Another protagonist who took a major downgrade, Gohan. Far worse than even in the Buu Saga, where Gohan can now barely go Super Saiyan and sports an uncharacteristic tracksuit and glasses. Yes, he degraded in the Buu Saga, but it stayed within the realm of reason, like falling from a 100 to a 90. But in Resurrection F, it was like falling from a 100 to a 10. Resurrection F also poorly utilizes Whis, or maybe more correctly said, his rewind ability. Since it can nullify anything, consequences don't exist anymore. At least with the similar wish-granting Dragon Balls, they come with conditions, allowing room for some tension. I.e., they need to be gathered, they could be harnessed by the enemy, or the party needs to survive long enough just to be able to use them. While Whis can just right any wrong instantly. Overall, it's just a cheap substitute for creative storytelling, and the only positive I could string together from it would be that at least it was revealed before its first use, so it didn't come completely out of nowhere. Next up, Frieza's newly introduced henchmen. For starters, their designs were generic and uninteresting. With prior minions like Zarbon and Dodoria, their appearances provided insight into who they were as characters. Whereas with these new guys, the most you can read out of them are surface-level concepts. Like, this guy's big and muscular, therefore he's strong, or this one's small and has a big head, so he's smart. Having a personality-defining appearance isn't necessarily required, as a unique look can be a worthy trade-off, but the new henchmen possess neither. Shisumi is just a standard ogre, and the duo of Tagoma and Sorbet just look plain. Besides their generic appearances, they cause other complications in the story. For instance, Shisumi's brief training with Frieza resulted in him attaining a power level close to Cell's, which in doing so devalue everyone else's hard work and sacrifices to achieve such a high level. The Saiyans had to endure a year in the harsh depths of the hyperbolic time chamber, while Kami had to cease existing to merge with Piccolo. And after all that, most of them still couldn't reach that level, so Shisumi really felt undeserving of that strength, especially when compared to the characters who we saw earn it. The next topic to discuss is the film's new transformations, starting off with Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan, or simply put, Super Saiyan Blue. Right off the bat, I want to say I actually enjoyed the ridiculously long transformation name for Super Saiyan Blue. It happens to be one of the few instances where a comedic moment could appeal to a multi-generational fan base instead of the now typical, oriented towards a younger demographic. Onward to the transformation itself. To begin, this variant of Super Saiyan was the only one not accompanied by an epic first occurrence sequence. In the original Attaining a Super Saiyan montage, Goku's head twitched with protruding veins, while the clouds stirred and lightning struck Namek. And with Super Saiyan 3, visuals of a great ape and Goku as an infant appeared. While the charging of the transformation itself produced window-shattering earthquakes spanning the entire globe. But Super Saiyan Blue had none of this, and at that point had been pretty much mastered off-screen already. Next, his transformation just seemed a little lazy, as it's just a color swap of Super Saiyan 1, i.e. little to no effort in making this look like it's reaching the next level. Plus, the color blue doesn't carry an inherent sensation of superiority to gold, as most cultures recognize the color of gold as high status. Think of the scaling of the Olympic medals, or the currency of the past. I presumably understand why the writers might have exchanged gold for blue, since the franchise of Dragon Ball globalized. Some new fan groups might construe a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Superman as offensive, but even if that was the case, it just seems counterintuitive giving Frieza a shiny new golden transformation and saying this is his most powerful form, so the overall logic of the film comes across as a bit inconsistent. With that said, one of the elements behind Super Saiyan Blue does contain an interesting attribute, which is that the transformation itself occurs when going Super Saiyan on top of the Super Saiyan God state. So this form, for now at least, isn't just Super Saiyan 5, which also provides a believable excuse for a dramatic increase of power. To be fair, I also have to mention Dragon Ball GT had already done something similar with Super Saiyan 4, which combined the Great Ape state with the Super Saiyan transformation. What I think would have fixed the logic with this new form would be by changing the color of Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan to orange, as the color of both previous states, when mixed together, create the color orange. So it would play on the existing knowledge and trends, while at the same time not making Frieza's new form feel awkward. Another grievance I have to air, semi-pertaining to the new transformations, is that Super Saiyan Blue, a god-level form, was brought down by a man-made ring laser. Realistically, by this point, the base form should be far beyond any man-made weapon, let alone a god-level transformation, so this action just lessened the supposedly powerful, newly introduced form in its own debut movie, and served as an uncreative way to bring down Goku. I feel the need to raise this next issue, but at the same time I can't hold it against the movie, and it's that the original Underworld HFIL was retconned. Now, since it's filler, and made by someone other than Toriyama, its erasure can't be fairly held against Resurrection F. But regardless, it leaves a sour taste knowing that a location intrinsic to the identity of the original anime adaptation can no longer return in the future of the story. Another question I have to ask, of all villains, why bring back Frieza? Even if it's due to popularity, his return and subsequent power-up make the least amount of sense of all villains. Cell and Majin Buu could absorb a higher power. Babidi could do weird black magic. Dr. Gero could use otherworldly materials to create a new machine. Or since the prior movie involved a Super Saiyan God form, why not bring back Raditz and Nappa as Super Saiyan Devils? Plus, when it comes down to it, the idea of Frieza returning has already been pretty much oversaturated. Post-Namek examples include the beginning of the Android saga, the Super 17 arc in GT, and the film Fusion Reborn, so its premise isn't unique either. If anything, I would have suggested reviving King Cold instead, since the story never shed all that much light into him as a character. And a film about him could answer unknown theories, like if he was in his true form or only his second one, and in turn his mysterious background would provide a better reason for never-before-seen henchmen coming to resurrect him. When I watch a Dragon Ball film, I either want a new story with new characters, or an elaboration on an existing one, and Resurrection F provided neither. So overall, to me, this movie just came off as an unnecessary filler arc. The following film is the first one stemming from the original series, Dragon Ball's third movie, Mystical Adventure. First of all, I need to add a little exposition on how the majority of the original series films operate, by essentially combining an early story arc with elements from a later one. And this movie incorporated basically anything relating to the Crane School, Tien, Chaozu, Mercenary, Tao, Crane Hermit, to the first World Tournament arc of Dragon Ball. How this occurred in the movie involved rewriting the character of Chaozu into playing the role of an emperor, where many students of the Crane School serve as high-ranking officers in his empire, most of them attempting to usurp his throne. While in the background, his nation hosts a world tournament. Essentially, all the Dragon Ball films act as a SparkNotes version of canon material, but the difference between Mystical Adventure and the others styled in this fashion is that the others, though inferior versions of the original anime, can still evoke fond memories, while this one really couldn't. What made everything great pertaining to the Crane School involved how it built off of prior events, as by this point, Dragon Ball had become less episodic and more focused on an overarching plot. Like this movie reenacted Mercenary Tao's killing of General Blue, but it failed to carry the same effect. In the original, General Blue had been established as one of the young Goku's toughest foes, only to be effortlessly licked by Tao, thus raising the mercenary stock as a future opponent, while this movie's iteration hadn't yet developed General Blue as a serious threat. So Mercenary Tao's defeat of him didn't seem as impressive, since he was basically just a no-name soldier. So Tao wasn't elevated in the process. A similar instance, again involving Tao, had Goku lose to him while simultaneously being blasted up towards Korn's tower. When he arrived, the wise cat told Goku to return to the battle but with a clear head, and afterwards, Goku almost effortlessly prevailed over the hired hand. How the movie wrote this scene came off as weak and random. He was unintentionally launched countries away towards Korn's tower, while in the original story's version, he was already at the structure's base, and by happenstance found Tao there. So the original made a better connection to points A and B. Next, the original's interaction between Goku and Korn had purpose, as Goku learned more about himself and picked up some new tricks, which made Tao's subsequent defeat feel more believable, without debuffing him in the process. But the movie just had Korn give Goku minor advice, and somehow he easily won in the next encounter, which in the end just made Tao look like a total chump, a shadow of what he's meant to be. Mystical Adventure isn't weak because it's just a pale imitation, but also because many elements that were actually decent didn't achieve their full potential. Like an element exclusive to the film was a conflict in the mind of Tien, loyalty towards Emperor Chaozu versus that of his teacher, the Crane Hermit, where he had to choose to side with either the Emperor who called him friend, or the usurper to that man's throne. How this conflict could improve and become more dramatic was if more of Tien's past with the Crane Hermit was elaborated on. Like, let's just say the Hermit in his backstory was shown to take in a young Tien. The mental struggle of him having to decide between the Hermit and Chaozu would have been much more serious. Before I move on, I want to mention one minor but clever detail in the movie that many might overlook, which was how the Dragon Balls were utilized, involving one of them falling into a deep dark cavern, thus winding up irretrievable. But how the group worked around it, so they could access their wish, had them drop the remaining Dragon Balls down into the cavern to reunite them and awaken the wish-granting Shenron. So that minimal motion did possess a certain sense of creativity to it. To sum up my opinions of Dragon Ball's third movie, it's decent, but a lesser version of an existing product, and everything new it added didn't mesh all that well with what it was going for. Oh, and by the way, O'Reilly from Dr. Slump, Toriyama's prior work, starred in a brief cameo for this movie. Moving on, Super Android 13. Now, what separates the early Dragon Ball Z movies and the ones from the midpoint on is that the later ones heavily marketed the film off of the design of its lead villain. What makes this all the more evident is the titles of the English language adaptations. Early Dragon Ball Z movies, The Dead Zone, The World's Strongest, and The Tree of Might. Some later examples include Cooler's Revenge, BoJack Unbound, and of course, Super Android 13. Now, since marketing became centered around appearance, sometimes it completely overshadowed quality storytelling, substituting the character of the villain in favor of style, and this trait is most evident in Android 13. Right off the bat, I have to say he has a good design. Not the best, but still decent. The contrast of his blue skin and reddish-orange hair, his expressionless face supplemented by his bony widow's peak, giving him a skull-like robotic killing machine-like appearance. And his gigantic stature promotes the idea that he is physically unstoppable. Now, just because his appearance looks visually appealing and can manifest mental images of what he is, doesn't automatically make it good. For instance, how he attained his transformation, where he initially started off as a man with long slicked back white hair, wearing what kind of looked like a trucker's outfit, only to absorb parts off his mechanical companions, which randomly turned him into a blue Hulk. This radically different alteration just seems unfounded, like there's no connection into what made him look completely different. And if you have trouble believing in something, it weakens its foundation. The other lackluster element in 13 in his film pertains to the fact that nothing about him as an android stands out from the rest of them. For instance, another creation of Dr. Gero, Cell, who within his makeup contains the genetics of every powerful fighter that came before him, along with the ability to absorb others, makes his superiority over the other androids legitimate. Whereas 13 had absolutely nothing to make him seem unique or worthy of his power. With Android 13, I would say the battle against him came off as one of the most forgettable against any Dragon Ball Z villain. I would even downright say some of the moments were boring and repetitive. Like after he powered up to his super form, Vegeta rushed him and threw a flurry of punches, only to be swatted away. Then for Piccolo to repeat that exact same action and suffer the same consequences. And after that, Goku followed suit as well. So this segment seemed more like a GIF than an actual fight. Transitioning onto aspects of the movie besides its titular villain, such as the locations, which primarily stuck to two areas, a bustling shopping center in an urban city, and a glacial region where the serious fighting occurred. To start off, I much prefer the beginning location in the shopping center, because this area was able to grant some insight into the characters. While Goku and Chi-Chi shopped in various stores around the area, unbeknownst to them, androids 14 and 15 hunted Goku, searching all over the area for him and destroying anyone or thing that got in the way of their target. So the androids' interaction with the environment revealed their personalities, as cruel one-tracked minds who would stop at nothing to eliminate their target. This area also possessed circumstantial effects too, like Goku couldn't fight seriously, as he didn't desire to accidentally hurt pedestrians caught in the crossfire, forcing him into a more defensive mode. In contrast, the frozen area in the latter portions of the story really brought nothing of interest to the film. The best I could say about the location would be, maybe it's a callback to one of the scenes in the anime series opening credits. Though I think you could argue that the glaciers provide a few semi-decent entrances for the other characters to join in the battle. All in all, everything about Super Android 13, the film and the character, just seemed bland, and none of the sideline aspects came off as worthwhile. Up next, the very first film of the entire Dragon Ball franchise, Curse of the Blood Rubies. Much like Mystical Adventure, this too is inferior to the original work, but unlike that, it served as a good summation of the arcs it featured, plus its additional content brought new dimensions into the story. First off, its plot essentially condensed the first saga of Dragon Ball into an hour-long movie, and exchanged the character of Emperor Pilaf for King Gurumez, whose greed transformed him into a monster seeking to consume rare jewels, eventually escalating onto the Dragon Balls that Goku and friends had been gathering. Why I personally believe Blood Rubies excels past Mystical Adventure pertains to it providing more exposition. Like early on in its story, it exhibited case of Gurumez and his soldiers oppressing residents of his kingdom, establishing a clear case of who was wronged and who was the true antagonist. So this film's portrayal of victimhood operated in a manner where you could visually see who was being treated unjustly and easily feel for them. While Mystical Adventure technically had victims in Upa and his father, they never felt persecuted, especially since Upa's dad could fight off his aggressors, unlike the villagers tormented by Gurumez. Also, Mystical Adventure having Chaozu be an emperor really added nothing to the Red Ribbon Army that they had replaced, while Gurumez overriding Pilaf explored new themes, like the effect of an evil ruler exploiting his subjects. Plus, Blood Rubies added new characters through the minions of Gurumez, like the duo of Pasta and Vango, one a small scheming woman, and the other an android 8-like brute. Already on their characteristics alone, they balance each other out, and they also have great chemistry with one another. But beyond that, they mesh well with existing characters, like the female Pasta had to square off against Yamcha, who at that point in Dragon Ball had difficulty interacting with women, putting him at a mental disadvantage, which she could exploit. A few weak points about the movie. First of all, many of its events felt like they occurred far too quickly. Like Goku agreed to go on Bulma's trip far too easily, but to be fair, that's expected of a condensed film adaptation. This next one may not seem as negative as how I explain it, but watching it will feel a bit rough. And said at the end of the film, it was revealed that Pasta manipulated the king, who presumably had never really seen beyond his castle, and upon learning his actions hurt others, simply decided to have a change of heart. So his epiphany did have some rationale behind it, but it definitely harms him by making him seem so oblivious. Final thoughts on Curse of the Blood Rubies? The show did it better, but the extra content provided some new value to it. Next up, the film that most people generally consider to be the worst in the franchise, Dragon Ball Z Bio Broly. I realize many might find this ranking above Resurrection F controversial, but I do possess a good reason for doing so, and it's that the existence of Resurrection F ruined its existing structural foundation, where since Bio Broly was a clone as a legendary Super Saiyan, he's technically his own character, and his existence doesn't really harm his former. I would actually argue Broly's second coming caused more collateral damage to the original than this film. But with that said, I do have to admit, the film was just a cheap cash grab by exploiting the name of a popular character, again like Resurrection F. I couldn't resist. My first grievance against this movie would be that it harbors no iconic moments that define its very nature, like a transformation sequence, performing a signature technique, or the defeat of a villain, but no scene really stood out from the rest. The most you could really argue would be Bio Broly decaying as he escaped his enclosure. Why a film requires those moments is because 10 years after watching said film, those are what you remember about it. And that's why I partially believe Bio Broly is regarded as the worst Z-era film. Though upon rewatching it in preparation for this video, I'm willing to say it was much better than what my memory led me to believe, or maybe how the fandom's negative promotion influenced them. I.e., if you have no fond memories of a work, the consensus perception generally overwrites your own opinion. But despite the film not being as bad as it's made out to be, Bio Broly appeals to the lowest rung of artistic merit. For instance, in the film resided a few alluring characters. An attractive woman working in the lab, and during a travel sequence, the crew flew by a group of swimsuit-clad ladies. I already know people in the comments will debate my following point, but here it is anyway, and said after the conclusion of the original Dragon Ball, Toriyama really sidelined beauty, more so feminine, especially in the humorous fanservice way. But this film attempted to resuscitate that style, like when Krillin rescued the attractive lab worker much to his own wife's dismay. The point behind this is that yes, the presence of attractive characters in funny situations can be pleasurable, but it's never totally satisfying, and can't really elevate a film up to the same level as, say, a good plot could. The other lowbrow appeal of Bio Broly pertains to the fact that it focuses on comedy over story. For example, the real antagonist of the film, Jaguar, possesses an intimidating persona, but despite that is kinda chubby and short in stature. And his right-hand man dresses fancy, almost like a mobster would, but is prone to clumsiness. He slipped and fell into Hercule's pool after menacingly getting out of his own car. So in a certain sense, these two characters satirized the mafia archetype. Like towards the end of the film after their base's destruction, they were reduced to begging Kid Trunks for assistance and had to obey his orders. Even the protagonist's entry into the story came about because the mob-like antagonists blackmailed Hercule into coming to Jaguar's island fortress. And what was used to lure Hercule? An embarrassing photo of himself of when he soiled himself as a kid, which again would be perceived as a comedic element. The other subplot in this story revolved around Hercule owing money to Android 18 for taking a dive into Prior World Tournament, and future events prompting her to further extort more cash out of the phony world champ. For the record, I actually enjoyed this, because they used an underutilized character like Android 18. I'd even go so far to say that she shared a good chemistry with Hercule, but then again, most of this was just for comedic relief. My opinion of comedy mostly mimics my thoughts on using attractive characters in art. Pleasurable, but you won't remember it years later. I also have to say, the two main characters of the story, Goten and Trunks, are two kids who pretty much goof around the entire time, and even inside the canon aren't necessarily known for serious or thought-provoking moments. So assume the writers deliberately chose to star as the leads don't necessarily connote high-quality entertainment. What I'm getting at is the film Bio Broly aligns more with the perception of the original Dragon Ball. Child protagonist, more comedy-centric, and even the real villain of the story syncs up pretty well with one of Dragon Ball's most prolific antagonists, Commander Red, both wealthy, influential, pint-sized bosses. Now, why this film failed to mesh with the fans pertains to what one seeks when they watch Dragon Ball Z, but especially with a Broly movie, which is manly, muscle-bound brawls laced with highly symbolic imagery starring characters with complex backgrounds and histories. So presumably when they received a movie more akin to Dragon Balls and Dragon Ball Z, they ultimately left disappointed. Even then, the attempt at making Bio Broly more resemblant to Dragon Ball still failed because it couldn't capture its essence. The idea of the wild child with no comprehension of societal norms, something of which neither Goten nor Trunks could fulfill, resulting in the movie having a sort of identity crisis, and is why people who are more fans of the originals in Z aren't infatuated with it either, and such is why it pleases neither fanbase in the end. Other tidbits about the movie I enjoyed included the animation sequence where the character of Bio Broly exited his birth chamber, the fact that water served as his weakness, making his defeat unique amongst the rest of the strengths-based movie villains, and finally, at the end of the movie after Bio Broly's defeat, a fun reference, where the deceased Goku was tasked with going to hell and stopping the rampaging regular Broly. Lastly, my final point about the discrete genius of the film Bio Broly, which occurred at its midway point, where Trunks provided a rather lengthy explanation of genetic modification to Goten, citing that his family comes from a scientific background, and how he said that led me to wonder if that was a subtle hint about his grandfather experimenting on his grandmother's DNA to help retain her youthful appearance. It's just a thought. Continuing on to Dragon Ball Z, Battle of the Gods. To start off, I have to add a disclaimer. Now, I'm trying my utmost best to judge the films as their own independent entities, like I don't believe a terrible retconning sequel should lessen the value of a great earlier work, or that a story that technically couldn't have occurred in the overall Dragon Ball timeline shouldn't be automatically discounted. But with that said, I find it difficult to assess Battle of the Gods strictly on its own merits, since at the time of its release, much of what was praised about the film involved how it possibly erased the generally unfavorably perceived GT, or overwrote Z's awful original ending. And there's even the fact that this movie resurrected a thought-to-be-dead franchise. So some of Battle of the Gods' most positive assets are factors external of the film itself. Plus there's the overlying issue that the film itself supposedly exists within the franchise's canon, as opposed to the parallel universe setting of the other films. So to fairly analyze Battle of the Gods, for what made it so well received, I have to include its relation to the main storyline. With that out of the way, I'll move on to my breakdown. Now, I initially entered this film apprehensively, as I knew the cast of Z was going to be far surpassed, and pretty much at the time, I saw the characters of Dragon Ball Z as the absolute peak of strength from any medium, anime, comic books, television, etc., and seeing Goku's Super Saiyan 3 form so easily bested was hard to swallow. But the more I reflected on it, I soon came to realize that doing so wasn't that outrageous, as Z had done that several times prior. And many of those cases were far worse, like the existence of Frieza and his henchmen essentially turned the Saiyans into mere foot soldiers, or the absolute most egregious case in the entire franchise, where the legendary near-godlike once every 1,000-year Super Saiyan transformation got brought down by an android. So in retrospect, Beerus beating Super Saiyan 3 Goku, Majin Buu, and the rest of the Z fighters didn't cause all that much collateral damage. Plus the word Majin translates to demon, and Beerus is a god, so a god overpowering a demon isn't too out of place. Next, the antagonist of the film, Beerus, possessed a standout character design. For instance, the Egyptian god of death, Anubis, serves as the inspiration behind his look, which amplifies the idea of Beerus pretty much acting out a similar role. His color scheme, primarily consisting of purple, sends another message. Historically, people of royal status associated themselves with the color purple, so the use of said color in Beerus gives him a superior than you vibe. The physical features of the god also provide an interesting take on the concept of what strength looks like, as at first glance, Beerus's body looks skinny, possibly even sickly. Instead of the usual, more muscles equates greater strength design, which in and of itself toys with common perceptions. But deeper meaning exists within Beerus's construction, as at many times in the past, a skinny, sickly-looking appearance represented death, which again meshes well within the sphere of the god's occupation. Now, despite his great design, his character unfortunately falls flat. For instance, he doesn't carry the same intimidating presence as most earlier villains did. Like during the film, Bulma slapped Beerus without a second thought. Whereas at the beginning of Z, she wouldn't even dare attempting that on the much weaker Raditz. So Beerus lacks a commanding personality for an antagonist. To be fair, this deity is intended to be more of an antagonist than as an enemy, also more comedic-centric, stylized as a mockery of a spoiler-rich noble, but the problem about that is he doesn't go far enough in that direction either, as he just came off more as a shallow, uninteresting, bratty child possessing little emotional range. Now Majin Buu can appear childish as well, but he had a broad emotional range. Playing with a dog, he seemed like one of the most innocent characters, but episodes earlier, he uttered some of the most creepy, skin-crawling dialogue of the franchise. So Buu had complexity, whereas Beerus was only a one-dimensional brat. And if you don't like that archetype, he just seems obnoxious. Since I just brought up comedy for Beerus, I'll continue on that, and the best way to sum up the film's humor would be by saying it's flat-out infantile. Now, comedy has always played a part in the franchise, but never would I have said it was strictly limited to children. Think of the moments in Dragon Ball where Bulma accidentally exposed herself to Master Roshi. Multiple generations would have found that hilarious, for different reasons too, but everything considered humorous in the film never felt intended for an adult audience. Trunks calling Mai his girlfriend, Vegeta dancing, Buu and Beerus fighting over a cup of pudding. Literally one joke of the film was that if Emperor Pilaf got worked up, he would wet himself. So none of those examples could come off as clever, i.e. utilizing timing, double entendres, or a series of unfortunate events. In essence, meaning the humor is one-dimensional, aka kids' humor. The only thing that could even evoke a little smirk on my face was after Beerus first woke up and moved around in a cute slithering fashion, and that's still only one-dimensional humor. With that said, a juvenile joke wouldn't be all that bad every now and then, but infantile humor littered the bulk of this film, to the point that I wish 40 minutes, specifically from Bulma's party, would have been completely removed from the film. Another weak element of Battle of the Gods pertains to how at multiple points it felt disconnected from the past. Like Toriyama himself is infamous for not having the best of memories, and it's fairly evident in the script. For instance, Beerus claimed to have killed off the dinosaurs, but in the past Dragon Ball iterations, dinosaurs have influenced major scenes. In the very first episode of the franchise, Goku rescued Bulma from a pterodactyl, and Gohan only survived the harsh training of Piccolo by feasting on the tail of a T-Rex. So Beerus' comment befuddles this movie's existence. Now yes, the franchise itself constantly introduced numerous retcons, but there are always workarounds for them, such as filler, or a lack of elaboration on whatever event it's referring to. But with Beerus exterminating the dinosaurs, it either has to alter past events, or simply couldn't have happened. With the dinosaurs, they actually played integral roles in this series. At least with other retcons like the redestruction of the moon, you could come up with some excuse to justify it. Like maybe after Roshi destroyed it in Dragon Ball, someone used the Dragon Balls to wish it back into existence before Piccolo blew it up again. The other way the film felt out of line with the rest of the story pertains to how the current iteration of characters don't match up with who they were in the past. For instance, with how Vegeta interacted with Beerus, culminated in him performing a silly little dance for the god. Now for the most part, the Saiyan Prince had always played second fiddle to a supreme being that could instantly incinerate him if they so desired. Originally Frieza, now Beerus. But how he acted towards these similar people couldn't be farther from one another. To Frieza, he grit his teeth and obeyed every command, but maintained his pride, waiting for the correct chance to strike back. But for Beerus, he embarrassingly played the part of the fool, ridding himself of any prior dignity. Now, one might argue his behavior towards Beerus in Battle of the Gods can be rationalized as him not wanting to lose Bulma and Trunks, but even then, his past goal of taking out Frieza was probably just as important to him then as what his family is to him now. So his current behavior of being so quick to abandon his pride just seems out of character, or even out of the realm of what he would be willing to do. To take this a step further, even if you think love of family works as an acceptable excuse for his behavior, that's just not who he was. The film changed him into an entirely different character. In the Boo saga, he experienced character development, but not of the magnitude of turning him into this. While on this topic, I need to mention Vegeta's choice of apparel for the film. Now, many fans love the idea that he returned to wearing Saiyan battle armor again, but I honestly disliked it, as him shedding his armor in the Boo saga symbolized him losing touch with his Saiyan roots and adapting to Earth's culture. But with him sporting the armor again in Battle of the Gods sends the message that he's embracing his Saiyan heritage. But despite that, his depiction in the movie, he's less Saiyan now than ever. So his attire no longer syncs up with his personality, meaning that as a work of art, Battle of the Gods lacks the same artistic depths of its predecessor series. On a further note, the creators presumably intended this to serve as a fun homage, but with its inclusion, just displays that they probably didn't understand the original work. On a side note, seeing Bulma slapped by Beerus gave him a massive power boost, even beyond the levels of a Super Saiyan 3. I just hate this idea every two ways around it. A minor power boost from emotion, I understand, but skipping over the Super Saiyan 3 tier lacks credibility. Seeing future Trunks murdered by Cell didn't push a Super Saiyan Vegeta to a Super Saiyan 2 tier level in the past, but a slap to Bulma warranted the power to injure a god? This is just a blank check to do whatever now. Think about Tien making an appearance at Bulma's party, like he skipped over visiting a friend who resurrected from the dead, but for some reason came to celebrate Bulma's birthday party? If he didn't come see Goku, I don't see him doing it for a birthday party either. This one I don't emphasize too hard as it is within reason, but still out of left field, and it's how the Pilaf gang reappeared as children in this movie. Yes, with the Dragon Balls it is possible, but it still seemed odd. Plus they felt too childish as well, more of like actual kids than adults who regress back to childhood. Another point that semi-applies to this topic involves retconning Frieza's motivation for wiping out the Saiyan homeworld, where instead of exterminating them to prevent a future warrior that could potentially oppose him, he now merely followed Beerus' orders. This seemingly minor inclusion unintentionally lessened numerous aspects of Dragon Ball Z. Like many of the best dynamics present during Goku and Frieza's climactic battle on Namek ceased to exist. Plus demoting Frieza down from top dog to lackey does diminish what he was as a character. A good way to sum up the causes of many of the film's inconsistencies would be by saying the insertion of Beerus into several major events just brought everything out of alignment. Dinosaurs, Frieza's motivation, the Saiyan's history, and even Vegeta's perception of reality. Switching gears to his strengths of Battle of the Gods, which was its own cliche-defying end, but even beyond breaking the established rulebook, it possessed a greater charm by opening many new doors for the franchise. Like its progenitor went off in an unfulfilling tangent, essentially locking the story in place, whereas this one broke through the ceiling, allowing the series to reach greater heights, like indicating there's still more room for Goku and the gang to grow. The comment Beerus made saying there's people stronger than him meant there's new characters to meet, and the revelation of other universes opened the floodgates to go on more adventures. But with all these positivities, a catch joins alongside them that becomes very apparent if you return to the film after Dragon Ball Super, which is that many of its great qualities didn't necessarily age well. The Super Saiyan God form, for instance, initially deviated from the usual mold of more muscles equals better. But in the very next movie, it returned to that exact same standard, initially rendering it moot. Plus, in the long haul, Super Saiyan God is the worst Super Saiyan variant. Now, I've commonly heard people say Super Saiyan 3 didn't really accomplish anything, but God did significantly less. Super Saiyan 3 fended off both Majin and Super Buu, plus bested First Form Janemba and killed a Rudigarn, while all the God form ever really did was make Goku last longer against a God of destruction. The film also provided a unique way of attaining said form, involving a ritual requiring 5 pure-hearted Saiyans holding hands, instead of the usual transformation instigated by rage. Though admittedly, the ritual accepting 3 half-Saiyans and a fetus in place of normal ones can be a bit awkward. Either way, it was still original. But again, the series continuing made this all the more broken, as Universe 6 contained an entire planet of pure-hearted Saiyans, which in essence could allow for an army of Super Saiyan gods to be birthed in mere minutes. So this transformation could really only be interesting under the circumstances during and before this movie. 2 other eccentricities that appeared creative at the time, but were ultimately lessened by the franchise continuing. Firstly, the fact that the antagonist Beerus wouldn't necessarily be considered evil, and that he ultimately prevailed over the protagonists. Now, Beerus not possessing malevolent motivations, Semi made him stand out from past enemies, so he felt different. But the following arcs of Super also introduced non-villainous enemies, Universe 6, most characters in the Tournament of Power, and the new Broly, all of which diluted Beerus' teetering on the edge of good nature. Plus, when you think about it, there had already been past villains who weren't necessarily evil either. Even in Z, like Android 16 or Fat Boo. So upon reflection, it wasn't unique as everyone first thought either. Essentially the same applies to the Z Fighters losing the overall battle. Since Hit technically defeated Goku in the Universe 6 tournament, but ultimately chose to take a dive against a phony strongman Monaka, which in the end mimics Beerus beating Goku and friends, but opting not to destroy them since he became fond of them. And there's also a decent argument that the Z Fighters lost to Goku Black and Zamasu, since they succeeded in destroying future Trunks' era, which was what the Z Fighters tried to prevent. I did say future aspects shouldn't lessen past events, and I still hold that true, but it certainly didn't improve Battle of the Gods upon rewatch. The best way to describe my overall thoughts on the film would be by saying I think the majority of fans, myself included, originally overrated Battle of the Gods, due to influences from external factors. Like by the time of its release, the fandom had been starving for new Dragon Ball content, and since the franchise had been dormant for years, this satiated their hunger. Plus the potentiality of overriding unfavored content came as an extra bonus. So I definitely think that skewed the ratings towards a more positive end. But if you watch the film objectively, I don't think it will look as great as it originally once was perceived. With that said, this is definitely a decent film though. Continuing on to the final Dragon Ball movie, The Path to Power. In contrast to the 3 prior Dragon Ball films, this released during the mid-90s, the era of Dragon Ball GT, to celebrate the franchise's 10-year anniversary, by retelling the beginning of the series and combining it with the Red Ribbon Army saga, which makes it kinda similar to the first movie, Curse of the Blood Rubies. But why this surpassed Blood Rubies originated from The Path to Power, acting as a celebration of the original work, and staying true to the original message. While Blood Rubies, in an effort to create something new, rewrote the original story, which in the process made certain elements feel out of alignment. The other quality of Path to Power surpassing Blood Rubies pertains to its later release date, which allowed the action sequences to be more over the top, and even incorporate elements from Dragon Ball's future sequels. Like at one point, it appeared as if Kid Goku was on the verge of turning Super Saiyan. On to the negatives of the movie. Now, just like the priorly mentioned films, this can't compete against the original anime adaptation. Like you can't expect a single movie, compilation to be on par with around 100 episodes of a story, without complications of making everything feel rushed. For instance, the story heavily focused on the friendship between Goku and Ader/Android 8, but since the film condensed the original story to such a high degree, them becoming best friends almost came out of nowhere, which made some scenes feel forced, like in the climax of the film, where Ader randomly appeared to aid Goku in the final battle against Staff Sergeant Black, who in this adaptation had been reskinned to look more tan. Earlier, I said this film blended in characteristics from both Z and GT into the Dragon Ball formula. What I meant by this is that many energy-based attacks ramped up their impact, causing massive destruction which was more comparable to the future series attacks. Another example of this being within the character design of Goku, who in this film more resembles GT's Kid Goku than the originals, as the original Goku looks pudgy, whereas this new rendition was built more lean and muscular, again, more aligned with the series sequels. To end, this Path to Power potentially featured a fun scene referencing Star Wars Episode 6, where hoverbike riding soldiers of the Red Ribbon Army pursued Goku, which, at least to me, highly resembles a speeder bike chase from Return of the Jedi. Overall, of the 3 Dragon Ball movies intended to retell the original story, this one performs the best at it, by being the most faithful to the source material, and introducing the least amount of collateral damage-causing elements, and in my opinion, did the best at reminding me what was so great about the original series. Next up, the second Dragon Ball Z film, The World's Strongest, where Dr. Wheelo seeks to create the perfect entity of both mind and body by transferring his brain into the body of the world's strongest, Goku. Right off the bat, what I like about this movie and its lead villain is his goal of stealing the perfect body, which seems far more developed than the standard villain's typical motivation usually involving revenge or world domination. And even if one argues his greater intention sought world domination, he at least possessed a more interesting one in between. The design of the machine where Wheelo's brain resides has an almost amphibian-like appearance, which not only looks great, but also stands apart from the rest of the villains of the Dragon Ball Z movie realm. This style also carries over into his lab as well, which gives this location its own intrinsic value. With that said, the character of Dr. Wheelo did contain some negatives as well, that weren't as original as, let's say, his design. as his defeat did follow one of my pet peeves amongst the movie villains, which is that the majority of them were brought down by some attack involving Goku borrowing energy from his friends. And the Mad Doctor himself fell in this manner too, though he does possess a unique defense against this criticism, as he was the first villain beaten this way, and every later example followed his lead. But a counter-argument to that statement could entail that the future enemies, brought down in a similar manner, did so in a much more dynamic fashion. Something else worthy of mentioning about the film was the utilization of Master Roshi as a fighter, which I could see perceived by different people as a negative or as a positive. On the negative end of the spectrum, this action had the Turtle Hermit break his promise of retirement and screwed up the series' current power scaling, i.e., he fought decently but still lost against opponents that effortlessly handled Piccolo earlier. And on the positive end, it utilized a character who hadn't really been more than just a spectator in a while, and actually integrated his legacy into the story rather well, as Wheelo, who had been dormant for decades, still lived under the impression Roshi was the world's strongest warrior, and at the beginning of the film, he captured Roshi with the intention of taking his body, which you could say justifies Roshi breaking his promise and fighting again, because the situation practically forced the old master into combat again. All in all, both sides possess a good rationale behind them. A few minor details about the movie I appreciated. First off, the battle between the mind-controlled Piccolo and Goku was very well animated, and creatively resulted in Goku duking out against him upside down while mid-air, and it also incorporated Gohan's unending faith in the goodness of Piccolo's heart, which itself tugged at the viewer's heartstrings. The film itself played with pre-existing knowledge. As for the bulk of the story, it led the audience to believe that Dr. Wheelo's partner in crime, Dr. Cochin, was a living, breathing human, only to later reveal, as he perished, that his body was actually mechanical. And finally, one of Dr. Wheelo's henchmen, known as Bioman, harbored one of the most unique bodies in the entire franchise, which was that it possessed qualities of rubber, like him being able to absorb physical-based blows without sustaining any damage, also resulting in one of my favorite uses of the Kaioken technique. To be fair, I would say the world's strongest consistently use Kaioken well throughout the entire story. Plus, the action sequences excellently portrayed the impact behind many blows too. Besides having a body of rubber, another one of the Biomen trio possessed the ability to freeze others. So the Biomen were all powerful in different ways, other than just sheer strength. P.S. The Ice Guy provoked a separate great instance of Kaioken, where Goku harnessed its might to break free of an icy prison. An aspect of the world's strongest that I am neutral about involved a scene that tried to replicate the effects of a certain scene from the prior movie The Dead Zone, where Gohan suffered a surreal hallucination, which in this movie's instance pretty decently reflected Gohan's mind at the time, where a giant tower of books reaching the skies loomed over him, while school utensils followed behind him, only for Gohan to stumble upon Piccolo, and he begins to follow behind Piccolo soon afterwards. So this montage expresses the conflict of Gohan's identity pretty well, the struggling of being the scholar his mother wants him to be, versus following his respected mentor's path. Why I'm neutral towards a scene that fascinates me is because it felt like it tried too hard to recapture that same wonder from the Dead Zone segment, causing it to not feel sincere. So even though I prefer the idea of how this movie did it better, it still just feels like it's an homage rather than its own original scene. Plus, it lacked the fluidic animation of its predecessor. Switching to a more negative light was what I consider to be the weakest link in the film, which is that nothing about it ever felt grandiose. For instance, Dr. Wheelo didn't really feel like a threat to the planet itself, or at least not until the very end, since much of the conflict involved an isolated group of friends, whereas with the first movie villain, Garlic Jr., entangled Kami, meaning the loss of him would also include the Dragon Balls, therefore no resurrecting deceased friends. So the conflict in the film really felt minuscule in comparison to the last. Plus, the World's Strongest doesn't really have that much of an iconic moment to its name. The most I could say to represent it would be the shell of Dr. Wheelo himself, and that's just a design. In all honesty, many of the scenes I best remember from the film stem from their inclusion into the English-language opening theme song, Rock the Dragon. The other topic to mention pertains to how you watched a film. Like, if you watched the Dragon Ball films in the correct order of release, this movie holds up a lot better. But if you watched them out of order, this may not seem as good in comparison. Like I said earlier, Dr. Wheelo's defeat came in the fashion of several other later film antagonists. But if you went into this movie without knowing the future villain's defeats, Wheelo's deaths may look better. This next film ranking so low I know will most likely cause a stir among those viewing, as many fans rate it as one of the bests. But for me, it can be a bit polarizing and difficult to rank against other Dragon Ball Z films, as its good qualities are exceptional, but its bad are flat out abysmal, restraining it from moving up further on the list. And this film I'm referring to is Fusion Reborn. To start off, I'll begin with its antagonist, Janemba. Remember how earlier I said the later movies often sideline interesting development, and instead marketed themselves on a cool-looking character design for a villain? Well, Janemba is the absolute pinnacle of that statement. Structurally, his build looks something akin to Satan, with a long reptilian tail, while horns protruded from his head. All this supplemented by the use of red and purple in his color scheme bolster this demon's devilish appearance, and besides that, he sports a sword, which is generally perceived as a symbol of what's cool. What I'm overall getting at is, Janemba has a great design, but despite that happens to be one of the most shallow villains of the entire franchise. Like, the only speech he's capable of uttering is his own name, and his lackluster background doesn't end there, as he's basically just a result of a freak accident, where an otherworld purification system blew up and transformed a young unattentive ogre into a monster. So he doesn't possess any real backstory, or at least in this film, to build off of anything. Cooler, Frieza's stronger, more experienced older brother, Broly, the legendary Super Saiyan, whereas Janemba, just an ogre covered in evil goo, which makes him being arguably the strongest pre-Battle of the God Z antagonist a little hard to stomach. Like, I wish there would have been more exposition into the otherworld purification system, like name a few powerful villains that went through it to help us understand why it was so effective, or maybe it could have spilled onto one of HFIL's strongest residents. Overall, just something was necessary to make Janemba feel deserving of his power. A common criticism of the franchise's villains is that they all embody mindless destruction, and if you believe this to be a legitimate point against the series, then Fusion Reborn sustains a massive blow, as Janemba is one of the best representatives of this negative trait, as he is just an ogre dipped in goo of pure evil. Regarding the person of Janemba, I also need to say this. Everything about him comes off as a less interesting replica of Majin Buu. Both begin as childish blobs and progress into smaller, more sinister versions. They both transmute objects into different things. Majin Buu turned people into candy, and Janemba turned a club into a sword. And finally, much of their skill sets revolve around body manipulation. So what I'm overall getting at is, Janemba possessing many allusions to Buu prevents him from being his own entirely original character. But even if, let's just say, Janemba released first, his function still wouldn't feel as natural as how it occurred with Majin Buu. Like, Super Buu shrank into Kid Buu after Fat Buu was removed from the lining in his body, while Janemba's shrinking was at best just for the hell of it. And with them altering their bodies, still operated better for Majin Buu, since his body consisted of a bubblegum-like substance, which inherently possesses a malleable texture, whereas Janemba, having a similar ability, just seems a bit out of place, as his body appears solid, which wouldn't carry the same composition for shape-shifting as was Buu, so it just came off as just giving an extra technique to a character that already possesses numerous abilities. Among their mutual characteristics, I can't confidently say Janemba did anything better or improved upon than his predecessor's style. At best, maybe you could say his transmutation ability equaled Buu's, but even then, a judgment like that comes down to taste rather than a factual argument. Now, when we venture away from his allusions to Buu, is where Janemba really shines as a character, like with his dimension manipulating abilities, which allowed him to sit back and create teleportation portals to hit enemies at a distance. And it didn't end there too, as it held defensive purposes as well, by providing him the ability to teleport away as a sort of dodge, which I might add was performed in a unique way, visually different from other teleportation techniques, where he particleized himself and reappeared far away. In summarizing my opinions of Janemba's abilities, I would say the writers accidentally broke him during his conception, because if you make something flawless and too overpowered, it loses realism, and giving him all of Buu's abilities on top of his own does just that. P.S. Insults weakening him isn't a real flaw. Now, when the first form changed ogres into smaller versions of himself, it indirectly sent a message that he's conquering HFIL, and his super form manifesting a sword sharing the same color scheme as himself reflects his now sadistic nature, as a blade's purpose involves violence, cutting things up. Having a sword in his fighting repertoire also created numerous iconic moments, like imprisoning an injured Goku in a floating pool of blood, and slicing into a jewel-like container, which in my opinion is one of the most memorable moments across all of the Dragon Ball Z films. Whilst on the topic of swords, in general I don't believe they have a place in the Dragon Ball world, especially after the appearance of Raditz, maybe even as early as King Piccolo, as any fighter by that point should be impenetrable to the sharpness of any metal. But with that said, Janemba is one of the few characters who I believe has an excuse to use one, since he basically conjured it from himself, and already possesses the capabilities of injuring powerful adversaries, explains how a blade could penetrate a Super Saiyan level foe and still be believable. So Fusion Reborn successfully pulled off something that shouldn't even be able to work anymore, which I would say is an overall strength of the film, and therefore in the character of Janemba as well. Returning to the nature of Janemba, I honestly prefer his first form, sometimes referred to as Janempa, over his second super form, and I would also say this applies to the first form's battle against Goku as well. Like his first form had more personality, as there was more to him than just a love of fighting. For instance, when Goku first found him, Janemba did not initiate combat, and Goku pretty much had to provoke him into attacking. Even his reactions appeared more as like he saw this as all just a game, as his behavior exhibited more playful traits than those of aggression. Whereas his second form, the most expression out of him, was his love of violence, as he smirked a few times during combat. And he pretty much just stood there silent, and it wasn't well conceived enough to be a case of says more by saying nothing. Next, I felt the fat first form used its body and shape better. Like when Goku first encountered him sitting on a giant jelly bean, Goku had to provoke him into combat by tipping him over the side, causing him to fall into the depths of the home for eternal losers. And this scene took advantage of his giant doughy appearance by making him so big and goofy that he's inadvertently also clumsy. The other instance where choreography made great use of his body involved him performing energy volleys, except while spinning atop his head and launching them from holes around his belly, which is in contrast to how most characters do similar techniques, usually originating from their hands. Now couple this with how he instead threw punches at a distance through portals, rather than fighting up close and personal, which when combined, create a unique combat style, where Janemba is basically a lazy armchair fighter. Now the second form did have its own iconic moments, arguably better than the first form's bests, but unfortunately the entire battle against him was not as consistent, as it contained several boring pauses, like waiting for Viku, the failed fusion between Goku and Vegeta, to defuse, or Goku trying to convince Vegeta to fuse while in hiding, which ruined the film's flow, and essentially just occupied time. Plus the best scenes involving Super Janemba weren't as long as you think, like his battle against Gogeta was surprisingly brief, for such a respected fight. One weakness of Janemba, in both how he was written and his corporeal body, entails how insults caused him damage. Obviously the writers intended this to be more used as a comedic effect than as a serious method of combating Janemba. But honestly, it wasn't all that humorous, and unintentionally wasted Pikkon as a character. One of its purposes in the movie had Pikkon trying to break King Yemma out of a bean-shaped prison created by Janemba, which shared its creator's weakness, so the bulk of Pikkon's time in the film was spent yelling at an inanimate object instead of having a real purpose. Now, this was intended to be funny, but it simply wasn't, and the only time I found it remotely entertaining was when King Yemma told Pikkon to hurry up, and in response, a frustrated Pikkon angrily yelled back, which indirectly damaged Janemba's seal, despite not being the intended target. All in all, insults as a weakness didn't really further the movie, and lacked credibility too. For instance, something like loud sound vibrations, maybe even a whistling noise, wink wink, would have been much more understandable, as they've been proven to in real life shatter glass. So insults just came off as an unnecessary detail. Plus the fact that it really wasn't incorporated into any meaningful battle against Janemba didn't help either. The final point on the role of Janemba within Fusion Reborn was that he wasn't the most memorable aspect of it, and instead Gogeta served as the main focal point of the film. Notice the title didn't feature Janemba in its name, unlike every other movie villain post-Triamite. P.S. Wrath of the Dragon can be argued as at least a double entendre, referencing both Hirudegarn or Goku's Super Dragon Fist. Whereas the title Fusion Reborn can really only apply to Gogeta. Now, despite stealing the show from Janemba and possessing one of the most amazing finishers in the franchise, Gogeta wasn't in the film as long as you might think. There's both a positive and a negative argument for it. Positive, he's so strong that he quickly dispatched a powerful Janemba. Negative, should have had more time devoted to him. Our personally side was the former, as the excellent choreography of his final clash more than made up for his brief on-screen time, so the little time he did actually have accomplished quite a lot. The setting serves as another strength of Fusion Reborn. Now, the majority of its events occur in Otherworld, but more specifically Hell/HFIL, an area that's already been explored before in the series. But through Janemba's tampering, these areas became filled with floating giant multicolored jelly bean-like objects, which when coupled with the unusual color scheme of the Otherworld, creates one of the most surreal landscapes of the entire franchise, in essence, turning an already ventured location into a brand new one. The film also incorporated the environment rather well too, like Janemba throwing Goku into a pool of blood, hovering it into the air and trimming it into a giant crimson jewel, or the instance where Goku and Vegeta hid from Janemba in a thorny briar. A major setback of Fusion Reborn pertains to failing to utilize latent potential. For example, in this movie, when the gateway between life and death opened, many prior villains returned from the grave, but none of them were ever really used, only Frieza. Though I will say I did enjoy when base form Gohan effortlessly beat Frieza with only a single punch, indicating how all the protagonists had grown so much since then. But they still wasted the potential of revenant villains returning. Like after Frieza's defeat, all the villains fled, but among them was Bojack, who at that point in time far exceeded the strength of Frieza. And in the past it took a stronger Super Saiyan 2 Gohan to beat him, but for some reason, fear of a base form Gohan warded him off. What I'm getting at is, the movie would have drastically improved if the returning deceased villains would have had their own battles. A rematch between Gohan and Bojack, maybe even Yamcha finally getting his vengeance against the Cybermen that killed him so many years earlier. But instead of that, what did the movie give us? Goten and Trunks versus the Dictator. Now yes, the film tried to be more comedic. The joke behind the situation is the real-life figure of whom this dictator is based off of had a fondness for people of blonde hair and blue eyes. And Goten and Trunks went Super Saiyan, imitating the appearances of the humans whom he preferred. But that joke went on for far too long, and is another reason for why I said there were too many lulls in the film's pacing. I will say the movie did use the returning dead rather well earlier, as a comedic device. One scene where an elderly man reunited with the ghost of his deceased former lover, who had died at an early age, ceasing the process of aging. But due to the man looking older, she had lost her attraction to him. But unfortunately, that brand of humor didn't carry on. I could go on ranting about this film longer, but I need to move on now. Next up, Broly's Second Coming. First off, I need to say having Broly return for a sequel was a huge mistake, as how he went out the first time was thematically perfect. I'll talk more about that later. Again, I repeat, a sequel doing something foolish, to me, doesn't weaken the predecessor, but it does inherently hinder the current work. I also have to say, Second Coming does have some negative connotations, as it corrupted the perception of the original Broly, by turning him into a narrow-minded brute who really only uttered one word. Getting on to the actual movie itself. Now, pacing-wise, this story took very long to get to its point, with only a handful of entertaining moments in between. But once it went going, it went going. Like, the action scenes felt very character-defining. Like a video game interpretation of Broly would mold his moveset around the action sequences of this film, as it featured him using more energy-based techniques over his physical-oriented ones of the first film, which you could say unleashed his full destructive capabilities. Next, even though this film originated the idea that Broly can only say the name Kakarot, he still spoke another line of dialogue without referencing it, where in an intimidating manner he said, "Not until you lie dead at my feet," which in and of itself is a potent line speaking volumes about the one saying it. Now to discuss some of the film's positives, pre-Broly's rampage. First of all, Second Coming played a trick on the audience, where every moment prior led us to believe the village of where the story took place held human sacrifices to a higher power, of which we, the audience, assumed to be Broly, only later to be revealed as just a simple dinosaur. So its trickery involved toying with the audience's presumptive knowledge. Another minor detail that will most likely be overlooked by the viewers is that the writers correctly matched the act of crying with how it was used in the first film. Now, most people erroneously believe the sound of crying turned Broly crazy, but what it actually accomplished was awakening his latent potential. In Bardock the Father of Goku, it stated infant Saiyans who cried a lot generally went on to become great warriors, and inadvertently the infant Goku's crying helped Broly unlock his true powers prematurely. So this film having Goten's cries reawaken Broly stays in line with his original conception. This next item to discuss is well done, but doesn't work with the idea of Broly, and it's how he pursued Goten and Trunks. One of these scenes entailed Trunks hiding from Broly behind a waterfall, where the hunter would peer in while the hunted would exit, moving back and forth thus missing each other. Now, despite being well animated, this scene just doesn't work. Yes, Broly's mind deteriorated after his last defeat, but having him fall for this just doesn't seem realistic or serious. Like, why doesn't he just destroy the waterfall? All this just seems like the writers were disconnected from the material they were making. Speaking of being disconnected, having Videl survive an encounter with Broly should be impossible. Yes, he loves tormenting his opponents, but Videl is absolutely nothing compared to him. She can barely fly, and in the past Broly destroyed entire galaxies. She frankly should have been liquefied by merely looking at him. And saying that since he wasn't in his legendary Super Saiyan form, so maybe she could have survived, isn't acceptable either. As the first Broly film heavily implied, he destroyed a galaxy without going legendary Super Saiyan, since in doing so completely broke Paragus' mind control device. Another of my complaints pertains to many scenes feeling like they are cut and pasted from the first film. Broly's redirecting energy blast, the actual legendary Super Saiyan transformation sequence, which looked like a tracing of the original, and finally, his death, which was a mixture of both Cooler and Cell's defeats. Cooler being incinerated by the sun, and Cell's was the father-son Kamehameha with the assistance of Vegeta, who in this instance was mimicked by his son Trunks. Despite Second Coming Broly's defeat being lifted and done inferior than its sources, it wasn't all that bad, as the writers added an extra element of mysticism/mystery to it. Like whether Goku's aid during the final struggle derived from a wish from the Dragon Balls, or whether it was just his son's imaginations. Either way, delivering a full picture without a specific answer does add some intrigue into the film. I said this during Bio Broly, and I'll reiterate it now, and it's that Goten and Trunks should never headline a Broly movie, as they are goofballs, while Broly as serious can get. so they don't mesh well as characters. Like Broly crushed his own father and hurled him into a comet, but when Trunks urinated on him, he simply let out a disgusted sigh and let him go. If this happened to Broly in the first film, he would have ripped whoever did that to him in half and bathed in their blood afterwards. But because of Goten and Trunks' inclusion into this movie, kid gloves were forced onto a character on whom they simply can't fit. On the flip side of things, I believe there's a fair argument in saying Second Coming gave Gohan some of his best moments post-teenage years, as his battle with Broly respected his power and depicted his ingenuity by luring the legendary Super Saiyan into lava. So this movie broke the trend of turning Gohan into as much of a dork as possible. Moving on to the very first Dragon Ball Z film, where Goku and friends enter the Dead Zone. To start off, this story really feels like a movie, rather than just a slightly longer episode, primarily stemming from the studio behind it investing heavily in tone and atmosphere. Like the very first scenes include Piccolo seemingly defeating, non-combatants like the Ox King and Chi-Chi attacked from behind, and a young Gohan kidnapped, all of which promoted a sense of something dastardly occurring in the shadows. In terms of atmosphere, the setting broke away from the main series' frequent use of bright colors, like blue and green, and instead opted to use eerie colors like a reddish-orange in the background sky, and utilizing a darker color palette in the residence of the film's antagonist to capture a more ghostly, malevolent vibe. And both of these instances combined create an almost hellish ambiance. The great uses of tone and atmosphere weren't restricted to just making sinister locations, but also in a more lighthearted montage as well, where the kidnapped Gohan ate an alcoholic fruit, sending him into an intoxicated paradise populated by dancing dinosaurs. Another brief instance involved Kami sitting inside a dark room penetrated by beams of light, which is something you'd expect from a Cena confession in like a religious movie. So this minor one may be brief, but it still possesses potency. Dead Zone also expertly blends qualities of both Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z together, like Goku dueling sword-wielding henchmen with his power pole atop a building, Z's action in the style of the original. The film's humor mostly centers around Gohan, which also feels very reminiscent to Dragon Ball's style by doing stuff that would be considered too risque by Z's future standards. One frequent issue with many films pertains to the fact that many antagonists almost randomly appear out of nowhere seeking vengeance on Goku, but Dead Zone mixes it up, where the villain Garlic Jr. bears a grudge against Earth's current guardian Kami. Now in their history, Garlic Sr., the father, competed with Kami for the title of Earth's guardian, but due to his corrupt nature, was ultimately banished away to the Dead Zone, only centuries later for his son to escape and seek vengeance against a man who won his father's desired role. Right away, Garlic Jr.'s past works well as the mainline story, a reasonable explanation for no prior mention or appearance beforehand, as he was sealed away in the Dead Zone, plus his existence never interferes with the canon timeline, and also provides more info into Kami's past. Garlic Jr.'s role in the movie also had him steal the Dragon Balls to wish for immortality, and pursue a battle with Kami in which he claimed victory. To break away for a second, Kami had almost always been an underutilized character in the story, at best just an onlooker, so his participation in the effort against Garlic Jr. helped the franchise employ an underutilized character. Next, after defeating Kami and unleashing his true might, he forced the enemies Goku and Piccolo to work together, which at the time of this movie's release would have been considered as a major event, ultimately resulting in his downfall and subsequent resealing in the Dead Zone, serving as a karmic sense of justice, as his newfound immortality would prevent him the sweet release from the cursed Dead Zone, as death would be a better fate than an eternity doomed to walk the Dead Zone, or at least until a future filler arc. An element making the conclusion of the film unique is the defeat of the villain, as most enemies, even among the canon ones, are stopped by either a Kamehameha or some combination of the protagonists combining their strengths together, so him being sealed does grant his fate some originality, or at least within his own franchise. Final conclusion on the Dead Zone? Overall, really well-rounded. Some complaints, a little too short, nothing about it ever really went over the top. Up next, BoJack Unbound. To begin, a strange peculiarity exists within my opinion of the film, where I strongly prefer its first half to the battle against its antagonist, which is odd because almost overwhelmingly the clash against the villain is supposed to be the most memorable portion of the movie. Now, BoJack Unbound's story begins with all the Z-Fighters, sans the deceased Goku and the disinterested Vegeta, participating in a tournament to determine the universe's strongest fighter. Right off the bat, I have to say, this film did justice to almost all the Z-Fighters. Basically, everyone is in the tournament. Like in an early round, Tien faced future Trunks, fighting toe-to-toe with him until his half-Saiyan opponent turned gold and sent him flying out of the ring. What I like about this is how the scene acknowledges the might of the non-Super Saiyan Tien by showing that he can compete with the base form of a Super Saiyan level opponent. The tournament also featured an amusing scene with Krillin, where he scored a technical victory over Piccolo, who during their match became uninterested in fighting a weak opponent and simply flew off, granting Krillin a win by forfeiture. So Piccolo technically losing to Krillin adds a certain playfulness to the story. Next, Dragon Ball frequently uses Yamcha as the butt of a joke, generally involving him being humiliated. Well, this movie did it too, but in the best and least spiteful way in the entire franchise, where a dejected, lost-in-thought Yamcha rested atop a pillar, lamenting about the fact that since the tournament involved Super Saiyans, he couldn't possibly win, while unbeknownst to him, an average human, a sumo wrestler, knocked over the structure he sat upon, accidentally wringing him out in the process. So yes, this moment had Yamcha be the butt of the joke, but it didn't insult his strengths or who he is as a character. And later on, there's a scene that actually counteracts this embarrassment, where he, along with Tien, heroically aided Gohan by facing Bojack's minions, knowing full well they couldn't win, but in doing so, could alleviate some of the weight off of Gohan's shoulders. And those actions display bravery and courage, qualities generally perceived as admirable. Next, his following detail may seem minor, but it speaks volumes, and that in this film, Gohan wore his father's outfit, which brought one of the most major themes from the Cell Saga into this movie. The apprentice becomes the master, the protected becomes the protector, essentially indicating Gohan grew and learned from the encounter with Cell, and accepted his father's role as the hero of Earth. The next fantastic element of the film pertains to Bojack's henchmen, whom I'm willing to go so far to say are the best looking set among all movie minions. Now, despite some of them never even being referred to by name in the film, their designs provide much insight into who they are as characters and what they represent. For instance, Zangief's appearance gives off the impression that with her seductive looks, she'll lure you into a trap only to stab you in the back. Beeto's design with his signature mohawk, beard, and muscular physique scream tough right-hand man, while Bujin's partially shrouded head and shorter build help him appear more like the sinister warlock of the group. What sets them apart from all other gangs of henchmen is that they all belong to the same race, which includes their leader as well. Blue skin plus orange hair, making them all feel like they share a specific history together. So it's almost like there's something deeper rooted or closer in them than just being a random smattering of different aliens that happen to serve under the same master. Not only did the characters of the movie look amazing, but the actual setting of the story did as well. Like the production of the tournament itself convincingly looked like something out of a real-life once-a-year festival. Jets spewing multicolored fumes, the contestants who passed the first round riding on decorative rockets, and even the rings inside the stadium were surrounded by moats. Plus the backgrounds kept fluctuating to new and interesting environments. For instance, Krillin initially confronted Zangief in a lava-based world, while future Trunks started battling the sword-wielding Goku in a flowery field, progressing through a bridge into a body of water and concluded in a modern city's alleyway. And finally, the war against the titular villain too possessed multiple locations, but primarily centered in a town reminiscent of Central Europe. The last great aspect of the movie to discuss regards the events surrounding how Gohan managed to defeat Bojack, which came about by having him release the full brunt of Super Saiyan 2. Now, I don't especially believe Bojack's defeat was all that legendary, but the fact that the battle required Gohan to return to the state that he had to use to beat Cell carried an epicness all in its own right. Keep in mind, at the time of this film's release, in-story and out-of-story, Super Saiyan 2 still remained the apex of power, not yet demoted to a slightly spikier Super Saiyan form. So this really escalated the situation. Plus, Gohan going Super Saiyan 2 also provided a satisfying, overpowering feeling. Like when Bojack's henchmen utilized a binding technique that had worked on Gohan prior, only for it to fail against him in this state, felt emboldening. And the following scene carried the sensation as well, where the henchmen physically attacked Gohan, only for him to literally slap them out of existence. Much like to how Gogeta dealt with Janemba in Fusion Reborn, you could argue Super Saiyan 2 Gohan plowed through Bojack far too easily as well. So again, apply both rationales from Janemba's case to this one as well. But Bojack Unbound holds at least one advantage over Fusion Reborn: build-up. For instance, Gohan eliminated two of Bojack's henchmen beforehand, and unhinderedly walks through their sealing technique. So there is more to the scene than just a few quick kicks and a deciding blow, which provided more time to appreciate the significance of the moment. Moving on to the negative aspects, starting off with what many might actually consider as a positive, which is the presence of future Trunks. Now, Bojack Unbound takes place after the defeat of Cell, but before the Buu Saga, so it's one of the few movies that could comfortably fit within the Dragon Ball timeline. But the insertion of future Trunks into the story seems out of place, as him returning to his home era symbolized he's no longer the dependent child and going to become his world's savior, so he'd presumably have to remain there and keep watch. Now yes, the story never explicitly stated that he couldn't come back and visit, but it just ends up a what are the chances he came back during a major event case. One element that did use him well was that he, a former sword user, fought against a current one in Kogu, introducing a fun dynamic into the battle, where he resided on the opposing end of how he generally fights. With that said, I still stand firmly in the belief that swords or weapons in general shouldn't have a place in Dragon Ball post-Raditz, unless they have a specific purpose. And Kogu's blade doesn't fall into that category. So, all in all, almost everything about future Trunks' inclusion into the film felt like he was only in it because he was a cool character that could garner more ticket sales. Another weakness of the film involved future Trunks' father's present-day counterpart, whose appearance also seemed to be included just to add another popular character. Except future Trunks' inclusion seemed awkward from a continuity standpoint, but was still utilized rather well, whereas the story poorly utilized Vegeta. Now, essentially after Goku's passing and Cell's defeat, Vegeta lost all enthusiasm for fighting, reducing him to merely watching it on the television, which after the Cell saga makes sense, but during the final battle against Bojack, he appears to aid in the efforts, only to get brushed aside rather quickly and not even managing to slow down the Jolly Green Giant. So I just think he was overall wasted potential. Like maybe something Bojack did should have awakened Vegeta's lost fighting spirit, or possibly he could have even helped Gohan. Like instead of Goku's poltergeist form freeing Gohan from Bojack's bear hug, maybe it could have been Vegeta instead, reenacting the battle with Cell. Sure, it would lose some of its spirituality, but it would have been more practical. Even after that, Goku's spirit still could have motivated Gohan to go Super Saiyan 2 in the end, while Vegeta's taking a thrashing, of course. On to the biggest issue in BoJack Unbound, which is Bojack himself, or at least what he lacks. Now, Bojack does possess an interesting backstory, being sealed by all Zakai's combined efforts, only to be unbound after one of them perishes, which is a direct result from one of Goku's canonical actions. So, right away that's a good way to show someone as a powerful being, but not an explanation for why he is so powerful. And the lack of exposition into him as a character is the true issue with Bojack. Think about it like this. He's the only villain with henchmen consisting entirely of people from his own race, but nothing about him or their origins were ever elaborated on. Despite that, it still feels like there's something inherently there. Like were he and his group the strongest from his place of origin and formed a team? Are they actually related to one another? Did they willingly leave their homeworld? Or were they possibly exiled criminals? Maybe they destroyed their home. Any minor detail like the ones I mentioned could have fleshed him out more as a character. But yet, there is nothing. What I think you could say is telling about Bojack was that he willingly sacrificed Zangia in an attempt to land a blow on Gohan, as the action reveals him to be afraid of death or disloyal. But even then, it's not like it conveys all that much about his personality, just a desire for self-preservation, which isn't exactly all that uncommon of a trait. The next weakness of Bojack pertains to the fact that he has what is essentially his own form of Super Saiyan, blue skin to green skin, orange hair to red hair, but much like his history, it was never elaborated on. Plus, in a minor disappointment, only he and Kogu ever performed it, so it went unutilized in his 3 more interesting henchmen. I did notice during both Bojack and Kogu's transformations that their jewelry shined before they turned green, so maybe that's somehow tied into them powering up, possibly hinting about the nature of their new forms. But even if that is the case, that's such an obscure detail that unless you analyze the film frame by frame, it'll probably go unnoticed, and for all we know, that glow could have just been purely aesthetic, and not even linked to their transformations at all. Its flawed incorporation to the story doesn't just stem from a lack of an explanation, but also through poor integration into combat, which occurred mid-battle, while he dominated Vegeta in only his base form, then to almost randomly transform and continue on at the exact same pace. So it didn't really feel like there's a reason for it to occur. Like, generally a power-up happens when one's backed into a corner, or to display a change in the emotion. But Bojack basically did it out of the blue, and because of that, it comes off as a bit unmemorable. The other issue with the film originates from not intertwining the villain into the plot all that well. For instance, the unbinding of Bojack was never shown, so without that, he had no real build-up to make him seem important. Like, that's what should have been the opening scene of the movie, him breaking out of confinement. But instead, his gang made their first real appearance randomly during the second round of the tournament, which in the end created a feeling that he was only in the film because it required a villain, rather than him being an interesting character all on his own. Besides that, there was no tie-in to explain why he came to Earth in the first place. Was it because Goku technically freed him, and Earth was that man's home planet? Or did he randomly stumble upon it during a path of destruction? Bojack just needed a motivation, or even a connection to the past, to elaborate on why he did what he did. Because without that, he feels like he just lacks a purpose. Final thoughts on Bojack Unbound? From a production standpoint, great action sequences, beautiful imagery, pretty much well-rounded. But from a structural standpoint, the film suffers from a lack of emphasis on its villain. which by the time of Dragon Ball Z serves as one of the biggest factors in determining whether a movie's iconic or forgettable, and that's what really holds this movie back from being up higher on the list. With the analysis of this film completed, we've finally reached the top 10, but as this breakdown has gone on for quite a while now, I've decided to split them into their own separate video. So with that said, thanks for watching part 1, hopefully you'll enjoy part 2, and I'll try to finish and upload it as soon as I can, if it hasn't already. Again, thanks for watching.